for us to learn a little bit more about the experiences of Jews in Ethiopia today, and those who want to make Aliyah and those who have made Aliyah. We have a special guest with us today, Jeremy Feit, who's going to speak to us. But before Jeremy begins, I'd like to introduce Isaac Wagner, who many of you know as a member of HIWP, who's going to introduce this event for us and who really put this whole event together. So thank you, Isaac, and thank you, YI, for co-hosting this with us. Isaac, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, I want to start with a video. So I want to maybe briefly discuss my motivation for why I invited Jeremy to come. When I heard about Jews in Ethiopia, my first thought was, didn't they all make Aliyah in the 80s in one of those operations, like Operation Solomon? And in talking to Jeremy, I found that no, there's actually a very large community in Ethiopia that are, very much Jews, familiar Orthodox Jews, and that want to make Aliyah and are living in very difficult conditions, and they're sort of struggling. And I talked to a bunch of other people in the community, and everyone also said, "Hey, didn't they already move into Israel? Isn't this a solved problem already?" And so that's sort of why I wanted to have this event, really to talk about what's going on today in the community, and just so people understand what's happening. So I will turn it over to Jeremy, who'll talk about a little bit of the history of this group. We also asked Alemu Neguise, who is a Ethiopian, and he is very involved in that community, to speak. It's 3 a.m. over there, so we pre-recorded some of his discussions, which we'll share with you, but he recorded it for this event. So I'll start with Jeremy. Take it away, Jeremy.
Sure. First of all, of course, I want to thank everyone who was involved in putting this together. It's really an incredible thing that people have volunteered their time and effort to help out in this issue, which is not well known, incredibly important, but not well known. And the communities involved, I really do thank you, Hakarata Tov, to everyone involved, especially, of course, Isaac, whose idea this was and who's been spearheading this. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to discussing. I'm going to start off with, and Isaac, I'm going to defer to you how exactly you want to do this. I think you want to stop for questions at the end, but I'll leave it to you to tell me to move it along or to embellish. And if anyone else of the moderators wants to do likewise, then please do. So we're going to start a little bit with the history of the community, which is hard to really fully address, because we know historically it goes back probably 2,000 years plus. We have records from early Christian kings who were called the destroyer of the Jews. The last Jewish kingdoms in the world actually were not in Israel, contrary to what we were taught in various Jewish day schools and yeshivas. There were several kingdoms outside of Israel, which is a historical fact, including in Ethiopia, where there was kingdoms on tops. They were finally driven out to the tops of mountaintops, and ultimately those kingdoms were destroyed. Where they actually come from is disputed. Rabbi Aliya Yosef, the chief rabbi of Israel, Sephardic chief rabbi, who was probably the most best known of the Sephardic chief rabbis, ruled in 1973, I believe it was, that they were descendant of the tribe of Dan, that when the Great Diaspora happened, the tribe of Dan was driven out of Israel, and they moved on down to Africa and further south, and ended up in Ethiopia. There's other theories about where they came from, sort of like the Kuzari type of theory, that some of the rulers, we know that many of the rulers of Ethiopia were definitely Jewish, and then there were theories that the rulers became converted to Judaism, and then converted segments of their population. There's other theories that have to do with traders that came down from Israel that were mingled with locals and got married and started communities. Regardless of where they come from, it's clear that there's certainly well over 1,000 years of written history of the Jews, not even coming from the Jewish chronicles, but coming from the non-Jewish chronicles, because they were always trying to destroy the Jewish people in the Jewish kingdoms. When we first came to American Jewish and wired their Jewish knowledge, I'd say late 1800s, early 1900s. But the movement to get them out didn't really move into any sort of, didn't move with any sort of fervor until after the opinion of Rabbi Avad Yosef. And it was first championed actually by American Jews. Israel was seen as not doing enough. And American Jews and international Jews were pushing Israel to bring them in. Historically, the Jews from abroad, the diaspora Jews, have felt themselves a separate identity, obviously, of Jewish, and while the Israeli Jews sometimes have a Jewish identity intertwined with Israelis. So it's often the diaspora Jews who are the first ones to react to other diaspora Jews in desperation, and that's probably reasons why the mass movement of Soviet Jewry started in America and diaspora, as well as the Ethiopian Jewry. The Operation Moses, which you may have heard of, I'm going to just do briefly all these things. It's a huge history, but I'm going to go very briefly, and then you can ask me at the end any questions. Operation Moses was an operation which happened in the 80s, and basically what it was is there was so much pressure by American and other diaspora Jews that Israel actually did start doing something, bringing out thousands of Jews. But it did so very quietly through the Sudan, which is just north of Ethiopia. During that operation, which took quite a long time, was a couple of years, the Jews walked across deserts for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. In fact, the gentleman you'll see a video from yesterday later, who is our head of operations in Ethiopia, he actually he has family members who walked through the Sudan. I'm seeing questions. I'll let the moderators tell me if you want me to answer questions now or at the end. To get to Israel through the Sudan, as I was saying, they walked through the desert. They were often attacked by marauders, by robbers. There was murder and rape and all that type of things that would happen to desert people walking through the desert is actually what happened to them. A little known fact is about a third of the people in Operation Moses didn't make it to Israel because they were died in the deserts on the way there. You may have heard of the most recent movie that came out. I think it was called the Red Sea Diving Resort. It had to do with a secret Mossad agent operation where they operated a diving resort, quote unquote, on the coast. That was really a cover for boats to bring Ethiopian Jews I think they start off in smaller boats, leading to larger boats, ultimately heading towards Israel. Another part of Operation Moses was secret air bases, where they'd pick up a spot in the desert and there would be hundreds of Jews camped out in the desert in the dark in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly they'd light up lights and the planes or helicopters would see the lights and come land quickly. Everyone would get on board and get out before anyone knew what was happening. This went on for quite a long time. It brought out thousands of people. Ultimately, the operation was stopped because there was so much pressure put on Israel to do something when people thought they were doing nothing, that it was leaked that this operation was happening. Once the leak came out that this operation was happening, Sudan was put under a lot of pressure by the Arab countries around, who obviously did not want more Jews going to Israel, to put a stop to it and not allow Jews to go through their territory for Operation Moses. In fact, that's what happened. The operation was stopped before it could be completed. That's a really brief description of Operation Moses. Operation Solomon was even, in some senses, it's the one that comes most to mind when you think about the Aliya from Ethiopia, and it's the one that just looks like a miracle out of the Bible. The north of the country, there was a rebellion going on at this time when they were throwing out the communist regime, was called the Derg regime in local Amharic language. And the rebels, which were a couple of groups, were coming in close to the capital. At that time, the Prime Minister of Israel had decided he wanted to airlift people out. when the rebels were, I'd say, a mile or 2 miles outside of the airport, and it looked like they were about to take over, something amazing happened. Within about 36 hours, the planes with all the Jews that they were allowing in at that time were brought out. The rebellious group stopped their advance. We don't know why they stopped their advance to this day. And within an hour or two of the last plane taking off, they took over the runways and the airport, and no other planes were allowed out. So they really just made it out in the nick of time. That was Operation Solomon, which was done in great secrecy and an amazing success for Israel. At the time of Operation Solomon, there were thousands of people who were not included on the list to be brought out, many of whom had to be beaten off. If you watch the less glorious videos, Operation Solomon, you will see people being beaten off the planes just like they had now in Afghanistan, not allowed on. That was a group of people. People didn't know exactly who they were. They knew they were affiliated with the Jewish people, didn't exactly know their status. At that time, the chief rabbi of Israel on Shabbat picked up the phone and called the prime minister and said, these people are Jewish and they have to be brought in. And the prime minister decided he didn't know who they were and he was not going to listen and did not let them in. Those people would be the service of my lifetime for the past, I don't know, I'd say 21 years, and for my father's 30-something years. And those people who were separated, some of whom were distanced, some of whom either nominally or actually converted, all of whom either returned or continued to be Jewish if they hadn't been distanced over the past bunch of years. Israel has been on and off in terms of whether they're going to bring them in. But since the Operation Solomon, when the prime minister declared that all Jews were taken out, actually 55,000 of these people have been taken out, more than Operation Moses and Solomon, all the other many operations combined. That sort of brings us to modern day times where I guess the questions I wanted to ask were a percentage, who has, what is the status of these people, relatives in Israel, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to cover that in like 60 seconds. It's a big topic, but suffice to say, Israel, the Jewish law and Israeli rights to return, which are under the law of return, the law of entry, do not coincide with halakha, Jewish law. So there are people who qualify to go to Israel who are not halachically Jewish, and there are people who do not qualify to go to Israel who are halachically Jewish. Because of the way these rules were laid out by the Israeli government, families were split in two. So a mother or father may have had to choose whether they're going to Israel and leave their children behind or just everyone stay. Because of that situation, 70% of the people now in Ethiopia waiting is approximately 14,000, maybe there's a couple extra thousand in the villages, but approximately 14,000 people. 70% of them have first-degree relatives in Israel, including sons and daughters who served in the IDF, parents, siblings, children, et cetera, which is why over time Israeli government has come slowly and in an excruciating way ends up admitting them, because whatever the Israeli government position is on any given day doesn't change the fact that mothers and fathers and daughters and sisters and brothers in Israel are never going to give up on their relatives. And that is why the 55,000 ultimately, yes, we've had a part to do with it, but that's ultimately why they're getting in, because the relatives just won't give up on their families who've been waiting an average of about 17 years now. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll take a break here and let, unless there are follow-up questions or let the moderators continue, is that when I say there are 14,000, they're mostly in two cities now. The vast majority, I'd say 11 or 12,000, are in a city called Gondar, which is very near where the war is happening with Tigray, with the rebellious group now, which I think we'll get into later. A smaller group, about I'd say 3,000, are in Addis Ababa, and there's probably a couple of thousand who are not part of the organized Jewish community, who are actually in the Tigray region now, which if you read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, with the rebellion, all the murders, mass genocide that's going on now, they're directly in that conflict zone now.
Okay, I'm now gonna turn it over to Alemu Neguise, who pre-recorded this. for this event. So let me just find that.
Shalom Lakulam. My name is Neguise Alemu. I am 43 years old. I'm an Israeli from Ethiopia. I was born in a village called Dembia in North Ethiopia. I grew up as a shepherd. Life was not easy at all in the village, especially when you are recognized as a Jew. Particularly, my life was not easy because my parents divorced when I was 5. My parents had 10 children together and I was the last one. My father left the village I was born in and married another woman in another village. It was very difficult for my mother to raise us, so I had to go to work at a young age. I was supposed to work for other people for any pay. In this village, people knew me as a Jew. Once a childhood friend of mine cursed me, a curse I will never forget it. Cursed Kaila, a curse that would be said only to Ethiopian Jews. Such curses were said to Jews in Ethiopia, but I was badly hurt because the boy who cursed me was a good friend of mine and close to me, and I didn't expect it from him. Shortly, life was more difficult for me due to two main reasons. The one, my parents divorced. The second one, to be in an environment that is not in the favor of your affinity for Judaism. In the early 1990s, we learned that our father came to Addis Ababa to immigrate to Israel. The situation in Addis Ababa was not as he expected. As the Israeli embassy, they didn't believe that my father and other people, Jew, they were rejected. In 1990, in the early December, I set out a new journey to the capital city of Ethiopia, a new world for me. As it mentioned to Abraham Avinu, go to the land which I will show you. After 3 days, I arrived in Addis Ababa. When I arrived in Addis Ababa, the situation was not simple. I have never seen a city, and suddenly I had the capital city of Ethiopia. I grew up in a world that had a herd of animals, such as a herd of sheep, cows, and bulls, and the like. And suddenly I met a herd of people, droves, which a different culture and a different speaking style. A herd of vehicles of all kinds. It was shocking to me. In 1991, there was Operation Solomon. My family and I were in Addis Ababa, but the Israeli government did not allow us to immigrate to Israel on the grounds that we and many other families are not Jewish. Luckily for us, an American organization came to the rescue of those who refused to immigrate. I waited for 8 years until I immigrated to Israel on January 25, 1998. The education I gained in Addis Ababa helped me a lot when I immigrated to Israel. When I arrived in Israel, I studied in Ulpan and was immediately accepted to preparatory program at the University of Haifa and was accepted for a first degree at that university. When I was a first year student, I got a job from the Ministry of Education as a Hebrew teacher in Ulpan. Since then, I have started coming to Ethiopia on my vacations to help my brothers who have been left behind, who have been denied migration by the Israeli government. For the past
So I'm now gonna sort of pause him. He'll come back later and talk about what he's doing. But Jeremy had alluded to the fact that there's a war going on in Ethiopia, particularly in a region called Tigray. The primary Jewish community there lives in Gundar, which is right next door. So I want to share a BBC clip from a month or two ago about what's going on in Ethiopia.
The United Nations is warning of widespread famine in northern Ethiopia after months of fighting in the Tigray region between local rebels and government troops. The UN says without significant help, things could deteriorate to levels of malnutrition not seen since 1984, when Michael Burke's reports for the BBC prompted the Live Aid concert. The situation has been made worse by the government limiting access to aid agencies to go into the Tigray region, leaving civilians trapped by the fighting without sufficient food and water supplies. Here's our African.
Sorry, all right. Not seeing the video. Let me see if I can figure that out. Thank you for that. All right, let's try that again.
The United Nations is warning of widespread famine in northern Ethiopia after months of fighting in the Tigray region between local rebels and government troops. The UN says without significant help, things could deteriorate to levels of malnutrition not seen since 1984, when Michael Burke's reports for the BBC prompted the Live Aid concert. The situation has been made worse by the government limiting access to aid agencies to go into the Tigray region, leaving civilians trapped by the fighting without sufficient food and water supplies. Here's our Africa correspondent, Andrew Harding.
The men with guns are bringing starvation once again to Ethiopia. Across the fragile northern region of Tigray, months of conflict have destroyed farms, crops, and clinics. With access limited, much of the suffering here is hidden from the outside world. Fears of famine have been growing steadily, but today the UN told us that famine conditions have now arrived.
Their farms have been destroyed, their harvest was destroyed, their bank accounts don't exist anymore. There's hundreds of thousands of people in famine conditions right now in Tigray.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Korum, it lights up a biblical famine.
It's 4 decades since this region experienced a famine that shook the world. Is history repeating itself?
It is not unreasonable to...
So I think you get the general sense. There's a war. They're worried that the war will trigger a series of famines, unlike what's been in that country since the 80s and 90s, when it was back in the news. And it's big sectarian war. Jeremy also pointed out there's a lot of family in Israel trying to get these people across. So I want to share a clip on that. And let me see how to do that. Sorry, no, sorry. Wrong one. You see this.
Hundreds of Ethiopians demonstrated outside the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem Sunday, demanding that the government act immediately and allow their relatives to immigrate to Israel, following a government freeze on thousands of Ethiopian Falashmura who remain stranded in Addis Ababa and Gondar, waiting in camps to be flown to Israel. Years ago, the government promised it would look into the status of the Falashmura, but months ago, the government declared that the quota had been filled. Protesters held pictures of parents, children, relatives, and others from whom they'd been separated from for many years.
אני חזרתי לפני 3 ימים מאתיופיה ראיתי עם האחים שלנו שממתינים לעלייה בגונדר, אותם אלפים שאנחנו דורשים מממשלת ישראל שתבדוק אותם ותאשר את מי שזכאי לעלות על פי קריטריונים של הממשלה עצמה.
זה אח שלי גדול, הוא קטן, הוא מתפלל בבית כנסת, הוא אזן. היינו ביחד כל המשפחה, צילמנו תמונה, גם אנחנו רוצים נאו ביחד, אבל אמרו לנו הם לא יכולים לעלות לארץ ישראל. למה? הם שלהם היבה. אמרו לנו סבתא שלהם היא לא יהודי. למה? היא פה. למה נשארו? זה ילדים שלהם. أكون زي مش بس بإثيوبيا
نحن رتيب شيء بكشة شلانو شيء عليه لانو نحن لمسالو كبار لحقود هذا سرش أنا نحن محكي ومريم لانو أود خدش تابو أود خدش تابو لمسالو أوش اللي قاعد تلاقيهم أوش اللي فارستا مش بحشلانو شلين تبع غوندر بعد سبب مسكين إلا إن بايت إلا إن مادama فول هيود أكشام أكلوا شيء لكو بزي بتكنست متباللين بزي روحهم لمسايم إم يوديم توك مود ولهم كل رجعهم ولهم بمت مسالين موتام بايم إم توك مود أنا شمكايلة بمت لمسايم لو ببت كنست شل نصريم ببت كنست شل لايم يوديم بمت إم ولهم كيبا
إما شلي بيتو بينما أو شلي بيتو بيا وشلي بيتو بيا لما ربي زمانني لبعد لما إما شلي لما بيتو بيا لما بقندر لما برام كل أسمان ونفسي لما بيا كل أسمان بيا إما شلي لما أكشلي طاقت شلي لما
The Prime Minister's office emphasized that immigration from Ethiopia will not stop, but that the active search for Jews will not continue, noting that the government will look into all requests. An official from the Prime Minister's office declared there is no commitment to a specific number of Falashmora members that will immigrate to Israel, but there will not be one Ethiopian Jew who has the right to immigrate to Israel based on the law of return who won't immigrate.
So I'm now gonna we'll finish this by talking about what Jeremy and Neguise and people there are doing for this community. I want to start with Neguise again, and I'll talk about what he's been doing. If I could find it.
Isaac?
Yeah.
If I can just, before Neguise comes on, just explain to you, which I showed earlier who he is. He's the head of our operation in Ethiopia. He grew up as a street kid without parents in Ethiopia. And he probably would not have survived if not for our programs. He felt such a sense of hakarat hatov that he had to give back, that he left his own family in Israel and has been running our programs there for 5 years now.
Okay. Do you see him on the screen? Did I get the screen right?
Yeah.
Okay.
6 years I have been working in Ethiopia as a program manager for a community awaiting immigration in Ethiopia. These programs are sponsored by an organization called SSEJ, or Struggle to Save Ethiopian Jewelry. Especially in the last 5 years, there are a lot of programs in the awaiting communities in Ethiopia, and the SSEJ organizations invests in these programs millions of dollars every year. SSEJ has received a license to work in Ethiopia as a foreign organization to assist Jewish awaiting immigration to Israel in both Addis Ababa and Gondar in various fields. Programs such as Jewish summer camp in Addis Ababa and in Gondar, at least to 1,400 children, includes meal, Jewish education for adults, including 2 7-week intensive programs for young leaders, Moria programs, called projects like Kirma, including daily internet classes, Judaism studies, Hebrew, Israeli, and Jewish history, preparation for Aliya, and internet writing salaries, wiring salaries, equipment, books, supplies. Israel volunteers 1 or 2 months period in Addis Ababa and in Gondar, and rabbis, eye surgery, especially Hitler by COVID, medical care for the elderly, Addis and Gondar, emergency medical expenses like hospital stays, and other humanitarian projects. Example, food distribution for elderly. SSEJ anti-COVID activities provision of clean water for hygiene purposes, development medical facilitators in Addis Ababa and in Gondar, +2 nurses program. Professional medical and hygiene supplies must flown in from Israel via diplomatic Hajj. Example, no-touch thermometers, oximeters, N95 masks, other costs of local available supplies. Food for sick community members, medical and hospital costs, distribution of soap to the community. In conclusion, without the assistance of the SSEJ or Struggle to Save Ethiopian Jewry organization, we would be lost many people from Ethiopian Jewish waiting in Gondar in Addis Ababa to make Aliya. So we'd like to thank you to SSEJ to saving life of the Jewish who are waiting for Aliya. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is sort of the area where they live here. All right, so Jeremy, I'll let you maybe take a minute or two to clarify
Sure.
what the organization does.
Let me step back from the organization itself a bit, because the organization to me is completely secondary to what's going on there. I'm going to give you some facts and then sort of try to paint a little picture for you. These are people who are internally displaced refugees. Ethiopia, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is in terms of third world countries is about as bad as you get. These people are internally displaced. They thought they were going to Israel with their relatives. They left their little villages where they were farmers and sold all their belongings thinking they were going to go to Israel. This is an average of about 16, 17 years ago. They went to Addis Ababa or Gondar because that's where the Israeli government was bringing people out of. And then they got stuck. So they have no means of livelihood in an area which was already terribly suffering. If they can find work, it's as day laborers earning about $2 a day. 60% of the children are malnourished, and medical care is very hard to come by. This was before we hit a famine, which is now going on because a locust swarm hit, 2 locust swarms actually hit, COVID hit, which I'll describe what happened in a second, and the civil war that we're talking about. Let me give you about 10 seconds on each of those. The famine raised food prices for these people who were on the brink of starvation to begin with. When we did the food distribution this Pesach, whereas last Pesach, the food prices for the emergency food, the grain that we buy, had gone up by 54%. So for people who could barely afford food to begin with, suddenly the prices of food had gone up by 54%. Then the COVID hit in a number of ways. First of all, of course, there's no vaccination in Ethiopia. I think currently 2% of Ethiopia is vaccinated. No members, as far as I know, of our community are vaccinated. Aside from the actual health concerns, the economy shut down. The entire country was shut down, just like America. The entire country was shut down for a while. People lost their jobs. These are people without bank accounts. If they make money on Tuesday, they eat on Wednesday. And they weren't making money. And that situation has not, once they quote unquote reopened the economy, it still hasn't improved much. The recession is terrible. Third of all, going to the war has done a number of awful things. The war has gotten within 40 miles of where they live in Gondar. Gondar is located on a major artery, a highway that's used, highway of sorts, a lot of it is mud and brick, but a highway of sorts that's used by the central Ethiopian government to bring arms up to the rebel area. So the rebels at one point, right before the rainy season, were marching their tanks right down this road, got within 40 miles of this area, and until they were stopped. That stoppage happened right before the rainy season. The rainy season is now over, and the war has continued. And just last night, the report I just got, which Isaac, I didn't even tell you about, thousands of people, of soldiers and civilians were just injured last night in this war. It's getting closer and closer to at least Gondar, where the majority of Jews are, and of course the Jews in Tigray are already in that area. It's also meant that the army has been buying up huge supplies of food, and international aid organizations have been buying up huge sources of food, as well as because the people were fighting and couldn't go to harvest their fields, or were driven out or murdered and couldn't harvest their field. The October harvest is expected to fail. All of this has led to and is expected to lead to larger and larger starvation and massive price increases for those people who are in areas where even food is available to be bought. We've had several members of the Jewish community killed, a few of whom just randomly, because the security situation in Gondar where they are has deteriorated to the point where people can't walk out at night. When I speak to Neguise, who you saw in the video, we will often get interrupted by gunfire, machine guns in the background. It's not the war, it's the lawlessness because the government can't control the areas anymore. And we're also trying to start programs to get people off the streets, because conscription gangs have been going around for the government, swooping up Jews, throwing them to the army where many of them don't return. So that's all on top of the fact that we have a situation where children and elderly and everyone in between weren't receiving medical care and food. The Israeli government did decide about 7 years ago, they were going to bring in 9,000 more. They actually didn't do that till about 9 months ago. They brought in 2,000, and the current absorption minister of Israel, a woman named Penina, tried to get another 6,000 out, was told she can get 3,000 out over 2 years. Even if that does happen at the rate of 1,500 a year, it'll be 10 plus years till everyone is out, assuming that the Aliya isn't stopped like it was last time. In the meantime, no one is providing anything at all to help these people. We're the only ones doing anything. I would very happily not be doing this. I'm a volunteer. Everyone doing this is a volunteer. 100% of everything that we do ends up going to Ethiopia. But there's no one left to do it. The Jewish Agency, to the extent it provides aid, does it through us. The Mandel Foundation, everyone else who's doing anything is doing it through us. We're the only ones on the ground. I'd be more than delighted if someone else would take it over and I can go back to my kids and working full time. But that's the situation we have. And just to put a face on it for a second, what does this mean? It means that a small little dinky organization, which 4 years ago had a budget of 250,000, and this year is putting out over 1.5 million, has to make awful decisions. I have to decide, for example, this is an actual decision I made a year ago. We have severely malnourished children of all ages. Do I provide a second meal a day to the severely malnourished children under the age of 5, or a first meal a day to children between the ages of 6 and 10? I was just asked a week ago whether we can increase from the ages from 5 to ages of 10 to feeding children. And I had to say no. The reason why we focused on children for food is because when you're under 5 years old and you do not receive proper nutrition, that's not something that can be remedied later on if you are fed. The stunting, that means not growing to your full height, and the mental issues that result from that are not some things that can be fixed later on. So the pediatricians that we've consulted with have told us that if we have a grain of teff, which is the food we give out, first you go to the youngest and you work your way up, and that's why we've started. We have, with 60% of the children under the age of 5 malnourished, we only have money to feed, is a total of 1,000, we have money to feed 500 of them. So that means 500 malnourished children under the age of 5 are not being fed. And our standards, by the way, are severely malnourished. If you're just regular malnourished, you don't get into our programs. If you're 6 years old and severely malnourished, you don't get into our programs. For our medical programs, we got a grant from Spartak Foundation for over 60 just because of COVID. Prior to COVID, there was no medical for any elderly people. Our medical programs go up to the age of 5. There are 1,200 kids in the program. If you get COVID and you're 6, or malaria and you're 23, there's no treatment for you. And so we focused on food, medicine, and education to the best that we can, constantly doing triages. it leads to situations. The other people we treat, I should say, for food are pregnant nursing mothers, because, for example, when I've been there and I walk into a home and I speak to the people there, and I'll have mother constantly, it used to happen to me, a woman would say to me, a nursing mother would say to me, I don't have enough food. I don't have milk in my breasts.
Jeremy.
Yeah, so that's the situation. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for giving us a viewpoint of what's going on the ground in Ethiopia, and a little bit about what SSEJ is trying to do there. I'd like to open it up for just a few questions because we have to wrap it up soon. But before I do that, I just want to say if anyone wants more information about SSEJ or what's going on the grounds in Ethiopia, you can feel free to email Jeremy. Jeremy, if you can put your email in the chat, if that's okay with you, or Isaac, and they'd be happy to give you more information. So I see we have one question, Jeremy. How many people do you have on the ground in Ethiopia now?
Is that, I'm not sure if the question is for number of Ethiopian Jews or staff members.
I think staff members.
Staff members, it's all our staff is programs. We have no administration in America or Israel. In staff members, it fluctuates whether we're doing camp or what programs we're doing. And we run after school programs and feeding programs. We're talking, I'd have to estimate sort of north of 50. North of 50 between the schools and the feeding programs and the medical programs. You count the medical clinics they run, partially they're staffed by, we run the programs, but they also serve other people. So I'm not sure how you count them, but it's a big staff and we have security. We need a lot of security. And
you said how many Jews are left in Ethiopia? You said about 14,000?
There are 14,000 between Addis Ababa and Gondar. There's probably a couple thousand Tigray where the civil war is at worst right now. We don't have accurate numbers for the Tigray region. They're not dispersed. They're not in the community like they are in Gondar and Addis Ababa.
Does anyone else have any questions? Anyone else have any questions? Oh, here. My understanding is that Ethiopians are brought into Israel under family reunification laws, not the law of return. Has that affected the process, I guess, for the good or the bad?
Yeah, it has. That's actually a very good question. It has. The Ethiopians are brought under the law of entry, not under the law of return. The law of return basically is based on the Nuremberg laws, where if Hitler would have killed you, will bring you to Israel. It's more or less the theory. If one Jewish grandparent, you're allowed to come under the law of return. That law was not applied to Ethiopia. Otherwise, they all would have been a long time ago. They've instead decided that they're not going to bring in people under the law of return. They've just made blanket statement no one qualifies under the law of return, which is obviously not true, but that's what the position they've held, and that they were going to bring people under the law of entry, which is discretionary. And that has been the way they've kept people out. We've gotten people in, as I said, about 55,000 since Operation Solomon, because we brought more than a dozen lawsuits in the Israeli Supreme Court, all of which have basically said, we're not telling you to bring anyone in. We're just telling you check their qualifications. And if they qualify, then you should bring them in. It was very hard to argue about, but the Israeli government did choose to argue about that, and they consistently lost. And hence we got in 55,000 people.
Great, Jeremy, thank you so much. Oh, wait, there's one more question. So this is going to be the last question. Is UJA Federation assisting? Have they stopped? Were they?
So UJA gives a small portion of the budget to the Jewish Agency. Jewish Agency is giving us 6% of our budget. So in that way, UJA is giving 2 or 3% of the budget. Broward County has just started helping us out, as has Greater Washington County. We're looking for more Jewish federations to get involved. Now that literally Broward County and Washington have just come up in the last few months, it's an active pursuit of ours to try to get the individual federations. In the past, they had, but we gave over all our programs to the Jewish Agency in a deal we had with the Israeli government about 5 or 6 years ago. We stopped fundraising when the Jewish Agency took over because this is not what we do for a living, right? So we just stopped, and at that point, all the agencies, all the federations dropped out, And we are starting to rebuild our connections now that Jewish Agency left a couple of years ago, and Israel has already stated that there are thousands of people left. So the answer in short is they're doing a very, very, very small amount. We would like that if the momentum is good, but from a practical point of view, it's less than 10% of our budget from all federation system.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Isaac put the link to SSEJ.org in the chat if anyone wants to learn more about the organization, or feel free to email Jeremy. Isaac, thank you so much for putting this together. Jeremy, thank you so much for the information. And thank you, YI, for partnering with us. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next event. Have a great night, everyone.